Okay, so in this video, we're going to start looking at research methods, and we'll expand on them in the next video or two as well. So in this video, we're going to be looking in particular on what we mean by research methods, what it means to kind of study society, as well as looking at 3 different ways of understanding society. And so some of this that we're talking about in this video, it actually comes from the first, I believe it's page 8 and 9 in the text. So it's in the first chapter, but it wasn't something I wanted to bring up on the first week of classes because it was just a lot to throw in at you. So we're going to go into that, and then we're going to link it into some other things as we discussed everything today. So we're going to be asking, well, what does it mean to study society? And how would a sociologist study society compared to other people? Because in a way, we're all sort of sociologists. We're all observing the world around us, trying to understand why people do what they do. And we might notice things. We might ask questions about what's going on, and we might be trying to understand how people are acting. We might look at something like a Rough Rider game a year ago and the different ways people might act at a Rough Rider game in Saskatchewan, the type of enthusiasm people would convey, the way that they would paint their faces green or wear watermelons on their heads, and that type of thing. And they might have their own ideas on why people might do this. But maybe it's a bit different than doing actual research and seeing if your common sense understandings are going to be reflected in reality or not. And maybe some of us are trying to understand what people are doing in this pandemic and why, and maybe we have our own perspectives on that. Maybe we're wondering why people bought so much toilet paper. Maybe we're wondering why people started making sourdough bread. And maybe we have our own ideas on why that is. Maybe we have a common sense understanding that maybe we could test it and see if that's really the case, if those are the reasons why people did those things. And so we start to ask these questions, and we have kind of a common sense understanding when we see different events happen, when we see even people who are struggling financially. We might have a common sense understanding for why that they are. When we see a different kind of breakdown between a family, we might say, well, it's because of this reason or that reason. But it's a different thing to have your own perspectives on things, and it's a different thing to see if that actually measures up in reality. So that's what we're going to start discussing today. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about, well, how can we study society? Can we detach ourselves from the world around us? And that's a really big question, and it's a hard one to really answer at the end of the day. That thought about, can we be objective? Can we separate our own assumptions, our own beliefs from the things that we see and feel? And also, should we, is another question too. Okay, and then the other thing is, what is the difference then between opinion and social science? So we've talked a lot about the different theories in social science, and for some of us it might seem like a collection of opinions, a collection of things that might even reflect how people see things in everyday kind of reality too, that people might vary on the political spectrum between one belief and another, and that might be sort of reflected in some of these theoretical perspectives. But there's also the question of, well, if we go to measure things, if we go to try and understand things in a systematic way, are we going to see things in a different way than our assumptions led us to think? Are we going to be comfortable if sometimes those things are contradictory to the things that we already are expecting to find? So if we take a look, and this goes back, I mentioned in the beginning that Auguste Comte, he's the one that came up with the term sociology, and he had some pretty strong opinions about sociology, but I wanted to revisit that for a moment. So again, this was in this period of the Enlightenment where there was this thought that we could really understand the world around us in a scientific way, and that's what we should strive to achieve. And so there were these breakthroughs in the natural sciences that there started to be this thought, well, there's universal laws around gravity, around all of these other things, around different rules around physics and chemistry, entropy and decay, and all of these kinds of things, that there seemed to be these rules about how things worked. And so the goal was to see if there are laws about society, are there things that don't change over time? And the goal was to kind of uncover those and find them. So this is very much a modern perspective. It's the thought that there could be these major rules that we could find and they would be reflected in every society. So one of the big arguments in this was that all societies kind of follow the same trajectory over time. They start as maybe a hunter-gatherer society, and they evolve maybe into more of an agrarian farming kind of society, and then they evolve into a larger scale civilization, etc. That it's all of these stages that all of these countries go through. And so it was kind of a thought that there were these universal rules about how societies form and develop and the stages that they go through. But that is something that's been called into question now. It's been called into question that maybe there is no one way that a society might operate. There's no one system. And actually, when you think about it, one country's kind of economic advancement in some ways, it might come at the cost to another. And that it wasn't necessarily a simple, and that's getting into a bit of a globalization conversation that we'll hopefully have more down the road. But there is a lot of critique of things like this now, these kinds of claims, and the kind of claim that some societies are more advanced or superior to others as well. So as well, this is something, just as a side note, that postmodern theorists would definitely reject. Right, because it's a modern perspective that there are these universal rules of how societies function. And a postmodern theorist would say, we can't make those kinds of claims. There's too much diversity. There's too much difference between people, between places. And so they would have a real issue with this. So, and the next question, which I kind of started to get at, is, well, can we be objective? So there was a firm belief when sociology was starting that an observer could kind of set themselves back and they could do research and they could keep their own assumptions, their own beliefs out of the research, and they could just see what was happening and report it, record it, and pass it on. But it is a real question to think about how fully objective a person can be when it comes to things that matter to them, when it comes to things about their own perspectives on gender, on religion, on race, and all of these things. Can we fully separate ourselves from that? And should we? So that's something to think about as we talk about some different theoretical perspectives in a moment. So one of the goals, though, these empirical methods, this is kind of where sociology kind of found its beginnings, found its foundation within these empirical methods. That is data collection that produces verifiable findings and is carried out using systematic procedures. So it's the thought that, like, how you could keep track of apples and how they fell, like Sir Isaac Newton did when he was understanding about gravity. That you could also notice specific things about the world around you, about how a person might interact with another person, that you could record it and report it and take note of it. And that you could also do it in a particular process, which is something that we call the research process, which we'll be discussing in the next video. But there's one major thing I want to continue to discuss in this video before we do that. Okay. And this comes back to the question again about this question around objectivity and the different beliefs around it. So, and this is again is something that it talks about in the first chapter of the textbook. It talks about these different perspectives. I don't like to include it that early on, or even when we're talking about the theories, because it can get a little confusing to distinguish these from the theories. So these are different kind of research perspectives that guide the research that is done. Of course, the theories also inform it, but these, something to think about as we discuss these three different perspectives on research is, are they related to some of the theories we've been discussing already? Can you see any connections between them? But this is more about the research methods and some of the beliefs behind what type of research should be done and how it should be done. All right, so the positivist perspective is the one that's more related to the ideas of Comte. And so what he felt and what some of the earlier research in sociology focused on was that we could physically observe things. We could keep track, well, how many times does a person shake hands with another person? How many times does a person act in this specific way instead of this specific way? And that we could kind of understand the world based on this kind of collection of empirical data, that we could kind of set ourselves back, that we could be objective, that we could just kind of record the things that we see. So that is essentially what the positivist perspective tried to do. It was based on the thought that we could collect information, we could analyze it, and we could look for these patterns to arise from that collection. So it would also be about thinking about the relationships between things. So it would be about, well, so to give you an example, if we were to talk about the pandemic, a positivist might think, well, let's see what's going on here. Let's think about let's think about are there specific government policies that we can look at? For example, we could compare the US and Canada and some of the efforts to support workers who become unemployed or less employed because of the pandemic. So we could look at these different policies, and we could look at the role of the government in creating these policies and shaping them. And so we could look at, well, what is the effect of these policies on the economy? So they could be relating government policies to the economy. And of course, they could also include a perspective on healthcare as well, and some of these major kind of institutions and how they impact each other. So it would be analyzing this in a big sense, looking at a whole collection of numbers, a whole collection of statistics. This might be a way that they would try to understand that, and they would say, well, this is what we can learn from this. We can say, if you give a certain amount of money, it has this type of effect. It creates this kind of positive function, or maybe it creates something negative and creates a sense of dysfunction. So maybe now you're seeing a connection to one of the theories that we've discussed earlier that could be kind of related to this perspective. So you have this perspective, and this was predominant. It was a dominant theoretical perspective on research for a while, that this is how research should be done. And in some ways, research still is done this way. Now, another approach is the interpretive approach, which it kind of reacts in response to the positivist approach. And it says, well, maybe we can't be that objective. Maybe we can't separate ourselves in the way that a positivist might think. Maybe we should question that ability to separate ourselves, and maybe we should focus more on the way that people create meaning in their experiences, that we should try to understand why people are doing things, that instead of focusing on this bigger scale, we should focus on the individual people and how they're engaging with the world, how they're engaging with each other. So in this case, if they were to study the pandemic, they might be interested in maybe looking at how an individual person might find Zoom conversations versus their regular kind of classroom experience. And maybe they would talk with a few people, but they maybe wouldn't talk with a huge number of people. They would focus more on the meaning and the experience for that particular person. They might wonder if they're feeling particularly isolated. They would wonder about the types of interactions that they're having and how they're creating meaning for themselves. So that would be the things that they would tend to focus on. And they would really pull into question a lot of things about certainty and about objectivity. So can you think about a theory that seems to relate in particular to this one? And once we're done talking about them, I'll mention the theories that I'm thinking of to see if they're the same ones that you are. Okay, so then the last one is the critical perspective. So the critical perspective also sort of agrees with the interpretive approach, where it's hard to be objective, it's hard to separate yourselves. But they would also argue that at a certain point, you need to come to a conclusion. You need to focus on creating change in society. You need to focus on who has power, and you need to focus on how to empower people who don't have power. So in this case, this type of research, when it comes to the pandemic, it might focus on, well, who is becoming wealthy, who is being impoverished, and who is more likely to be sick and denied healthcare access because of the pandemic. So then they might focus on, well, there seems to be a large number of people who are going to food banks, and there are a certain number of billionaires who have increased their wealth significantly as a result of the pandemic. And these are the things that they might look at. They might look at the way that women are in particularly being affected by the pandemic, if they're having to balance more things within the home or outside of the home, if they're having to juggle more things than they did before. They would definitely be interested in the kind of race dynamics that have come out of the pandemic. Not that they originated there, but that they seem to be kind of exacerbated in this period of pandemic. And they would think, well, maybe there's some kind of relationship there to explore. And they would focus on maybe meeting with these people and discussing with them individually what they think should be done and ways that people could be empowered and brought up to a more equal level. So maybe you can think of kind of three theories here that kind of could fit in with this perspective. Okay, so to clarify what I'm saying, the positivist approach, it has a bit of connection to structural functionalism. That there's a focus on understanding the factors and the relationships between them, and this idea that we need to create balance and equilibrium, and that we need to explore the way these different structures relate to each other, the economy, healthcare system, things like that. And this belief in objectivity, this belief that we can analyze society from a certain amount of detachment, that we're not bringing our own political perspectives in. Okay. And the next perspective, the interpretive perspective, it fits with symbolic interactionism. That is the theory that it tends to really connect to, although you could also argue it fits a bit with postmodern theory, and that postmodern theory kind of fits with critical theory as well. But maybe it's somewhere in between those two, really. So the interpretive one is the one where it focuses on meaning and the way people kind of interpret their experiences. And so it's a bit more of a smaller scale, more in-depth type of research. And we're going to give labels to these two differences in the types of research, this kind of about scope versus depth. So how many people are we talking to? How many people are we trying to understand versus how deeply are we trying to understand those people? So so we can say that it relates to the symbolic interactionist perspective in particular, this focus on meaning and individual experiences. And the final one, it relates in particular to the three conflict approaches on gender, race, and class. And it could explore any of these three or some kind of combination of them. So it's focused on thinking about these questions of power, those big fish questions again, that keeps coming back to that question about, well, are things fair? Are things just? Who has power? Who doesn't? And this is a big question that comes up a lot within sociology, to think about these things and to ask, are things fair? Should they be changed? If we understand society and we see it has limitations, does that mean we're required to address those changes? And then, so in that sense, it isn't possible to be objective, and that it's actually maybe wrong to be objective, that there's a need to take action and to involve the people that you're concerned with talking with, to see what they think needs to be done and to do that. So that just is something to get us started thinking about all of this. And we're going to move on to explore a little bit more of the ways that we can understand the research process in the next video. And we'll also be we're going to be looking at quantitative versus qualitative research and looking at some particular types of research. These are the things that we're moving into this conversation around. All right, so, and I just want to mention, if you do hear a bit of background noise, there's a bit of work being done in the house, and I apologize for that. I hope it doesn't really come across. I'm hoping that the sound is kind of muffled through the setup that I have. But yeah, so I will see you in the next video.